Nasruddin was friendly with most of his neighbours, but there was one woman who lived in his street whom he had always disliked. She was too interested in other people's business and too ready to talk about it with others, and she was always borrowing things from her neighbours and then forgetting to return them. This woman knew that Nasruddin had a new rope in his shed, and one day she came to his door and asked to borrow it. "Well," said Nasruddin, "before I lend you my rope, I must know what you want it for." "One of our neighbours is cutting a big branch off the tree in my garden," she answered, "and he needs the rope to pull it down with, so that it doesn't fall on my roof." "Hasn't he got a rope himself?" asked Nasruddin. "No, he hasn't," the woman answered rudely. "Do you think I would have come here to get yours if he had had one?" Nasruddin said nothing, but went into his house. The woman heard him talking to his wife, and a moment later he came out again. "I'm sorry," he said to the woman, "but I can't lend you the rope just now. My wife is spreading flour on it." "Spreading flour on it?" the woman cried. "But how can anyone spread flour on a rope? Are you trying to make a fool out of me?" "Certainly not," answered Nasruddin. "It's quite easy to spread flour on my rope when I don't wish to lend it to somebody."
It was Saturday, so Mr. Smith didn't have to go to work. It had snowed heavily the night before, and Mr. Smith's young son Bobby had a new sledge, which he was very eager to try out. There was a good slope in a park not far from the Smith's house, which children often used for their sledges, so Mr. Smith agreed to take Bobby there in the car. They put the sledge in and went off. When they reached the park, they found that there were already a lot of boys there with their sledges. They were sliding down the slope at great speed and then pulling their sledges up again for another go. After a few minutes, Mr. Smith noticed that there was one poorly dressed little boy there who didn't have a sledge. This boy had flattened out an old cardboard box and was sliding down the slope on that. Mr. Smith felt very sorry for this poor boy and determined to ask Bobby to lend him his sledge a few times. But before he could catch Bobby to speak to him, he was surprised and delighted to notice that several of the older boys in the park were lending the poor boy their sledges. Mr. Smith watched them carefully and suddenly realized that the bigger boys were not doing this because they felt sorry for the poor boy, but because they enjoyed riding on his cardboard box more than on their expensive sledges. They were actually waiting impatiently for a turn on the flattened cardboard box.
Jack was young, rich, and fond of girls. He hardly ever did any work, and spent most of his time enjoying himself. One summer he bought a big motorboat. As soon as it was ready to go to sea, he telephoned to one of the girls he had met somewhere and invited her for a trip in his new motorboat. It was the first of many successful invitations of this kind. The way Jack used to invite a girl for a trip in his boat was like this. He would begin by saying, "Hello, Laura," or whatever the girl's name was. "I have just bought a beautiful new motorboat, and I would like to take you out for a trip in it." The girl's answer was usually cautious, because everybody in that part of the country knew Jack's reputation with girls. She would say something like this: "Oh, really? That's nice. What name have you given to the boat?" Jack would then answer, "Well, Laura, I have named it after you." Of course, the girl would feel very proud that Jack had chosen her name for the boat out of the names of all his many girlfriends, and she would think that Jack must really love her. She would therefore be quite willing to accept his invitation to go for a trip in his motorboat. It would not be until she got down to the harbour and actually saw the boat that she would understand how cleverly Jack had tricked her, because there, in neat gold letters on the boat, she would see its name, "After You."
Night had come. There had been a big battle that day, and our army had taken the enemy's front line and then advanced half a mile beyond it. We were now in a trench which the enemy had dug as a last line of defence, and we could hear them digging themselves a new trench from which to face us in the morning. They dug in the stony soil all night, and by the morning we could see only the tops of their caps and their spades as they threw the earth out. In our trench, several of our soldiers spent the time after daylight had come shooting at the enemy caps and spades to see if they could hit any of them. One of the enemy soldiers, who seemed to be a sportsman, joined in our game. He would suddenly put his spade up, keep it there for a few seconds to see whether one of us could hit it, and then pull it down quickly again. Next time he would put it up in rather a different place. A number of our soldiers shot at it whenever it came up, but none of them seemed to succeed in hitting it. Then there came a time when the spade remained down for much longer than usual. We thought that the soldier might have been stopped from playing this game by an officer, or that he might have gone off for a meal or something. But just when we thought that we wouldn't see his spade again, it came up once more, for the last time, very slowly, and with a bandage tied around it.
George and his friend Peter were fond of deer hunting, and whenever they had a free day during the deer hunting season, they took their guns and went off into the forest. One Saturday, they were sitting on a log eating their sandwiches and drinking their coffee, when they saw a man walking through the snow towards them. He was dressed in deer hunting clothes, but he had no gun with him. When he got nearer, the two friends saw that he was following a deer's track in the snow. They were both very surprised to see a man tracking a deer without a gun, so when he reached them, they stopped him and asked him whether anything was wrong and whether they could help him. The man sat down beside them, accepted a cup of coffee, and told them his story. Like them, he'd gone out deer hunting that morning with a friend. They had seen a deer with very big horns, and had followed it for some time. Then he had fired at it, and it had fallen just where it stood. He and his friend had run over to examine it, and he had said to his friend, "This deer's horns will make a wonderful rack for my guns when I get it home." He had then arranged his gun in the deer's horns and stepped back a few yards to see exactly how they would look as a gun rack on the wall of his study. He had been admiring the effect when the deer had suddenly jumped up, shaken itself, and raced away, carrying his gun firmly stuck in its horns. In many seaside towns there are telescopes on the seafront, so that people who want to look at the view or at ships on the sea can do so more easily. You have to put a coin in before you can use the telescope, and after a few minutes you have to put in another coin if you want to continue using it. One day Mr. Brown was on holiday in a seaside town which had telescopes like this, and he was walking along the seafront when he saw two sailors looking through one. First one was looking, and then the other, and they were taking turns to put in another coin from time to time. Mr. Brown was rather surprised to see sailors using the telescope, because he thought that they would have had enough of looking at the sea while they were on their ship. Then he thought that they might perhaps be looking for their own ship on the sea, but that seemed improbable to him. How could sailors not know where their ship was? Then Mr. Brown suddenly realized that they were not looking at the sea at all. The telescope was pointed at the beach, and they were looking along it slowly and carefully. Mr. Brown wondered whether they had lost something. Suddenly the sailors left the telescope and went off at a fast rate, so Mr. Brown stopped wondering and continued his walk. It was not until half an hour later that he found out what the two sailors had been searching for with the telescope. He met them again, each with a very pretty girl on his arm.
Mary was very fond of television, so when she met a young man who worked for a television company, she was very interested and asked him a lot of questions. She discovered that he had also worked for a film company, so she asked him whether there was any difference between film work and television work. "Well," answered the young man, "there is one very big difference. If someone makes a mistake while a film is being made, it is, of course, possible to stop and do the scene again. In fact, one can do it over and over again a lot of times. Mistakes waste time, money, and film. But the audiences who see the film when it is finished don't know that anything went wrong. In a live television show, on the other hand, the audience can see any mistakes that are made." I can tell you a story about that. One day, a live television show was going on, and one of the actors was supposed to have been shot. He fell to the ground, and the camera moved somewhere else to allow time for me to run out with a bottle of tomato sauce to pour onto him to look like blood. But unfortunately, the camera turned back to him before I had finished, and the audience saw me pouring the sauce onto the man. "Oh, how terrible," Mary said. "And what did you do?" "Well," answered the young man, "our television director is a very strict man. If anyone makes a mistake, he dismisses him at once. So what could I do? I just had to pretend that this was part of the story, and eat the man."
Johnny was 4 years old, and his favourite game was cowboys and Indians. He had a cowboy suit and a belt with 2 guns, and spent most of his time pretending to be fighting Indians. One day his mother took him in a train for the first time. Of course he wore his cowboy suit and carried his 2 guns. He had seen a film of an attack by Red Indians on a train in the Wild West, so his mother was not surprised when he began playing at cowboys and Indians in the train. But when he wanted to open the window wide so that he could shoot out of it, she thought this too dangerous, and allowed him to have it open only at the top, so that he could shoot out of it if he stood up, but could not fall out. He was playing happily, hiding behind the curtain, suddenly stepping forward, firing a shot out of the window and then quickly stepping back again, when he suddenly gave a cry, fell back onto the seat, and lay there with his chin resting on his chest and his arms hanging loosely beside him. Of course his mother was frightened. She thought that something from outside the train must have hit him as he stood at the window. She shook the child gently, but he made no movement, and his eyes rolled in his head. His mother was now very worried indeed. She picked Johnny up in her arms to go and find help. But just then He lifted one of his arms with great effort, pointed to his chest, and said in a weak whisper, "Pull the arrow out, will you?"
The science teacher believed very strongly in practical work as a means of teaching science effectively, and she wanted her pupils' parents to see how well their children were learning by her methods. She therefore arranged for all the parents to come and see the results of one of the children's experiments on a Saturday evening when all of them were free. The children had been studying the growth of plants, and they had planted 4 pots of beans a few weeks before. They had put poor soil in one pot to see what effect this would have on the growth of the beans in it, and good soil in the other 3 pots. Then they had put one of the pots in the dark for several days, and had given a 3rd pot no water for the same length of time. At the end of the lesson on Friday afternoon, the teacher put little notices on the 4 pots. The beans in this pot were planted in poor soil. This pot has been kept in the dark for 4 days. These beans have had no water for 4 days. These beans have had good soil, plenty of light, and regular water. Then the teacher went home. When she arrived on Saturday evening, half an hour before the parents were due to come, she found this note beside the pots. "We read your notes to the school servant and thought we would help him. So we watered all the plants, changed the earth in the one with poor soil, and left the light on above the one that had been left in the dark for 4 days. We hope that the plants will now grow better. Your friends, the Boy Scouts."
King Frederick the Great of Prussia had a very fine army, and none of the soldiers in it were finer than his giant guards, who were all extremely tall men. It was difficult to find enough soldiers for these guards, as there were not many men who were tall enough. Frederick had made it a rule that no soldiers who didn't speak German could be admitted to the giant guards, and this made the work of the officers who had to find men for them even more difficult. When they had to choose between accepting or refusing a really tall man who knew no German, the officers used to accept him, and then teach him enough German to be able to answer if the king questioned him. Frederick sometimes used to visit the men who were on guard around his castle at night to see that they were doing their job properly, and it was his habit to ask each new one that he saw 3 questions. "How old are you?" "How long have you been in my army?" and "Are you satisfied with your food and your conditions?" The officers of the giant guards therefore used to teach new soldiers who didn't know German the answers to these 3 questions. One day, however, the king asked a new soldier the questions in a different order. He began with, "How long have you been in my army?" The young soldier immediately answered, 22 years, your Majesty." Frederick was very surprised. "How old are you then?" he asked the soldier. 6 months, your Majesty," came the answer. At this Frederick became angry. "Am I a fool, or are you one?" he asked. "Both, your Majesty," the soldier answered politely.
At the time when Bill and Rose married, neither of them had much money, so they were unable to buy a house or flat. For the first few years of their married life, they therefore lived in rented flats. Then Bill's father died and left him some money, so they bought a house. When they moved into it for the first time, one of Bill's best friends sent him a bottle of wine as a present to celebrate his entry into the first house he had owned. Bill and Rose had a lot of work to do, getting their things unpacked, arranging the furniture, getting curtains and all the rest. So they forgot about the bottle of wine. In fact, they put it away in a cupboard without even unpacking it. Bill and Rose already had 2 children when they moved into their new house, and a few months later, the 3rd was born. When Rose came home from the hospital with the baby, Bill invited some friends round to celebrate its arrival, and they had a wonderful party, with plenty to eat and to drink. After the party had been going on for some time, however, Bill found that the wine was finished. Luckily, he remembered the bottle which his friend had given him when they had moved into the new house, and which was still lying unpacked in a cupboard somewhere in the house. He found it with some difficulty, and brought it into the living room where his guests were sitting. When he had unwrapped the bottle, he saw a card tied to it, so he took it and read it aloud to the others. It said, "Bill, take good care of this one. It is the first one that is really yours."
Mr. Jones woke early one morning, before the sun had risen. It was a beautiful morning, so he went to the window and looked out. He was surprised to see a neatly dressed, middle-aged professor who worked in the university just up the road from Mr. Jones's house, coming from the direction of the town. He had grey hair and thick glasses, and was carrying an umbrella, a morning newspaper, and a bag. Mr. Jones thought that he must have arrived by the night train, and decided to walk to the university instead of taking a taxi. Mr. Jones had a big tree in his garden, and the children had tied a long rope to one of its branches so that they could swing on it. Mr. Jones was surprised to see the professor stop when he saw the rope and look carefully up and down the road. When he saw that there was nobody in sight, he stepped into the garden. There was no fence, put his umbrella, newspaper, bag and hat neatly on the grass, and took hold of the rope. He pulled it hard to see whether it was strong enough to take his weight, then ran as fast as he could and swung into the air on the end of the rope, his grey hair blowing all around his face. Backwards and forwards he swung, occasionally taking a few more running steps on the grass when the rope began to swing too slowly for him. At last the professor stopped, straightened his tie, combed his hair carefully, put on his hat, picked up his umbrella, newspaper and bag, and continued on his way to the university, looking as quiet and correct and respectable as one would expect a professor to be.
An American warship once paid a visit to a port in a hot country where the British Navy had a base, and the captain of the British base invited the officers of the American warship to a party ashore. Now, Americans like their drinks to have plenty of ice in them, even in a cold climate. But at the time of the warship's visit to the British base, it was generally known that the British hardly ever had ice, even in the hottest countries. The captain of the American ship didn't want to have to drink warm drinks at the British party, but it would have been very impolite to refuse the British captain's invitation. So the American captain accepted, but an hour before the party was due to begin, sent a small boat ashore to his host, with several large tins of ice from the warship's refrigerators. When the American officers went ashore for the party, they were looking forward to having plenty of ice in their drinks. They were therefore very surprised when, on their arrival, they were served drinks with no ice in them at all. They thought that the servants might perhaps not yet have had time to unpack the ice that had been sent from the ship. But the party continued, and still there was no ice. Of course, the American officers were too polite to ask what had happened to the ice that they had sent. When the party at last came to an end, the American captain thanked his British host for the pleasant party. Then the secret of the ice came out. The British captain thanked the American captain for it and said, "It allowed me to have the first really cold bath I've had in this place."
The soldiers had just moved to the desert, and as they had never been in such a place before, they had a lot to learn. As there were no trees or buildings in the desert, it was, of course, very hard to hide their trucks from enemy planes. The soldiers were therefore given training in camouflage, which means ways of covering something so that the enemy can't see where it is. They were shown how to paint their trucks in irregular patterns with pale green, yellow and brown paints, and then to cover them with nets, to which they had tied small pieces of cloth. The driver, who had the biggest truck, went to a lot of trouble to camouflage it. He spent several hours painting it, preparing a net, and searching for some heavy rocks with which to hold the net down. When it was all finished, he looked proudly at his work, and then went off to have his lunch. But when he came back to the truck after he'd had his meal, he was surprised and worried to see that his camouflage work was completely spoilt by the truck's shadow, which was growing longer and longer as the afternoon advanced. He stood looking at it, not knowing what to do about it. Soon an officer arrived, and he too saw the shadow, of course. "Well," he shouted to the poor driver, "what are you going to do about it? If an enemy plane comes over, the pilot will at once know that there's a truck there." "I know, sir," answered the soldier. "Well, don't just stand there doing nothing," said the officer. "What shall I do, sir?" asked the poor driver. "Get your spade and throw some sand over the shadow, of course," answered the officer.
Some boys join the Navy when they are quite young, and are then given a course of training as sailors. It's a long course, both on land and at sea, and during it the boys study things like mathematics and science, as well as learning to tie knots, fire guns, and do other practical things. One of the important things they are taught is, of course, how to swim. In the old days, many sailors were unable to swim, but nowadays it is rare to find one that can't. At one school for sailor boys, the swimming instructor was very good. He had never had a boy whom he had failed to teach to swim by the time the course ended. One year, however, there was one particular boy on the training course who seemed quite unable to learn to swim. The instructor tried giving him extra lessons. He tried throwing him into the pool at the deep end, and he tried holding him up with a rope tied to the end of a fishing rod while he attempted to swim. But he had no success at all, whatever he did. In the end, as the time drew near when the course was due to end, he had to admit defeat. One day he called the boy aside after the swimming lesson and said to him, "John, I have tried very hard to teach you to swim, but I have failed, for the first time in my life. Now I want to give you a piece of advice. Listen carefully." "Yes, sir," answered the boy. "Well," the instructor went on, "if you're ever in a ship and it sinks, just jump over the side into the sea, go right down to the bottom, and run to the shore as fast as you can. That's the only way you'll save your life.